Hello everyone, and welcome to my Biochemistry Basics presentation. Today I'm going to be taking you through the chemistry that makes up living organisms. So to start with, we need to have a discussion about the elements that are found in organisms. And we have a few terms that we're going to reference throughout this discussion, so I thought that I'd present those to you here. One term is going to be the term matter, which essentially refers to anything that occupies space and has mass. And there's three different states: a solid, liquid, and gas. We find the term element commonly used today, which is a substance that can't be broken down by any further by any normal chemical means. So there's approximately 92 naturally found elements in the world. The word compound is referring to a substance consisting of two or more elements that are commonly found in the body. And we talk about something called electronegativity, which is a measure of the tendency of an atom to attract a bonding pair of electrons. So it's important to note that when we're talking about compounds, they can have a different form than the elements that typically make them up. So for instance, sodium chloride on the right-hand side, which we refer to as table salt, we commonly encounter and use, and it's a very stable substance. But sodium is normally a metal that's not found free in nature because it's too active, and it's usually in a compound. And chlorine is actually a yellow-green gas that's extremely reactive and highly electronegative. So the actual state of those substances when they're outside of that compound can be different. Now, another thing to note is that within the human body, there are approximately 4 elements that make up the majority of our kind of building blocks, and that would be oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. There's also a little more than 3% of our elements found in our body are going to consist of the ones from calcium here through magnesium. And finally, we find something called trace elements that make up a very, very small percentage of our body weight. And trace elements are typically going to be essential ingredients that are responsible for a lot of hormonal behaviors and actions. A deficiency of this can lead to growth issues and miscarriage. So something like iodine, for example, which is found in seaweed, kelp, dairy, and dark greens, is very important to our bodies, even though it's found in very small amounts. Additionally, it's important to note that there can be a large number of symptoms if you're deficient in one of these trace elements. So for instance, if you're deficient in iron, you can have frequent headaches, brittle nails, hair loss, and a myriad of other effects. So just because something's found in a very trace amount or a small amount doesn't mean it isn't important to our bodies and to our lives. So it's important to note the fundamentals of what we're made of and the basics of these elements. So first off, what are the 3 subatomic particles that make up an atom? If you guessed proton, neutron, and electron, then you were correct. In this figure, we can see that neutrons and protons exist within the nucleus of an atom, and electrons are going to circulate around that atom. Now, if we take a look at this in a different kind of figure, we note that even though the electrons are represented as circulating in an orbital in any kind of figure or drawing, most times electrons really exist within this cloud of negative charge. So it's a little bit of an abstract concept to think about, but those electrons don't exist within this perfect circle. They're just kind of circulating in a cloud. When we're documenting or representing these elements, oftentimes you will see it written or represented with the elemental symbol, so the letters corresponding to an element. In the upper left-hand corner, you'll find the atomic number associated with that element, which actually is equivalent to the total number of protons. And in the bottom right, you'll notice an atomic mass. the mass number is actually going to be equivalent to the total number of protons and neutrons. For example, the mass number of helium is 4. However, it's important to note that this atomic mass here is going to be different from the mass number because it's the average mass of all of the isotopes. So just keep that in mind. That's why there's a little bit of a variation between the mass number and the atomic mass. Now, if we're discussing shorthand notation of isotopes versus notation in the periodic table, there's a little bit of a difference in that notation as well. So for isotopes, we will have the atomic symbol, the letter that represents that element. You'll also have the mass number along the top and the atomic number, or the number of protons, along the bottom. In the periodic table, we find the symbol, the atomic symbol in the middle. We oftentimes find the element number and the atomic mass along the bottom. In the upper left-hand corner is where you'll find the atomic number. So it's just important to note that there are different shorthand notations for representing these elements. Now, isotopes are going to be referring to elements that have the same number of protons but a different number of neutrons, and thus a different mass. There are approximately 250 stable isotopes and approximately 3,200 unstable or radioactive isotopes. A good example of this is with carbon. We find that the majority of carbon represented in nature is in this carbon-12 format. It has 6 protons and 6 neutrons. We also find in nature, however, that there's a carbon-13 and a carbon-14. Carbon-13 is going to have 7 neutrons and carbon-14 is going to have 8 neutrons. So we have a little bit of variation in that number of neutrons, which doesn't impact the type of element it is, but does impact the actual mass. This can be represented in our isotope form by having the different mass numbers along the top and the same atomic number along the bottom. So it's very important to note that electrons are really responsible for all of the chemical interactions that occur between these elements. And we know that electrons are going to exist within these different shells. Those that exist within the valence shell, so the outermost shell, are going to determine the chemical properties of that particular element. So this valence shell can be either the second, third, fourth, or fifth shell, but it just happens to be the outermost one that it's representing. Any unpaired electrons, which actually make the shell incomplete, are what's going to cause the substances or the elements to react with other elements or to form chemical bonds. So when we talk about chemical bonds, essentially what we're discussing is the combination or the joining of two atoms that both have incomplete outer or valence shells, and their reaction or their interactions really are going to consist of either sharing, donating, or receiving electrons. So in this example, we have 2 atoms of oxygen on the left-hand side. Each of them have 2 unpaired electrons. You'll notice that there are also 2 sets of paired electrons in each of these atoms. Electrons like to be paired up, so when they are paired up, they're not going to form any kind of bonds. It's only the unpaired individual ones floating around that are going to want to form those bonds. They form a chemical bond, and those 2 electrons are going to share between the 2 different atoms of oxygen. So it's important to understand some of the rules with respect to electron behavior. In the first shell, we find that there is 1 orbital that contains a maximum of 2 electrons. In the second, third, fourth shell, we find that there are a total of 4 orbitals, each that contain 2 electrons. So in total, there are 8 possible spots for electrons within a shell in the second, third, fourth, and fifth shells. It's only that first shell that contains a different maximum number of electrons. So as you can see in this example of silicon and aluminum, the second shell here in each of those is complete with holding 8 electrons. And then they move up to the next shell. So when we're talking about orbitals and shells, we typically in biology just refer to the electrons within a shell, but it's important to note that within that shell you have these different orbitals of electrons circulating. So it's a really kind of abstract, complicated existence of these electrons. So just keep in mind that within each shell there are different orbitals that the electrons are kind of following. We often find in the literature that electrons are distributed through something called an electron distribution diagram. And in this we have the protons and neutrons will be represented in the nucleus. You have a circle to represent that first shell, with the electrons being represented either paired up or separately within this first shell. And then you would distribute the electrons in the second and third and fourth shell. And you usually start by pairing up those electrons and then singularly kind of placing them along that shell. So if you'd like to take a second, you can go ahead and draw an electron distribution diagram for oxygen, which has 8 electrons. And make sure you include the protons and neutrons. Give it just a second to do that. All right, so hopefully you got something along these lines. We've got all of our protons and neutrons located in the middle, protons represented by the plus sign, neutrons represented by the white dots. And then in the first shell, you would have distributed your first 2 electrons. In the second shell, you would have placed an electron in each quadrant of the shell and then started pairing them up. So as you can see with oxygen, we have 2 unpaired electrons that are remaining. Generally speaking, if all electrons are paired up in the valence shell, meaning you have a total of 8 represented in that valence or outermost shell, then the elements tend to be more stable. They don't tend to form bonds with other elements because of the fact that they already have electrons that are kind of satisfied by that, by the pairing off of electrons within the outermost shell. We have several different types of bonds that are created by these electrons, and the first we're going to discuss is covalent bonds. And I like to remember the phrase sharing is caring when I'm thinking about these types of bonds. Covalent bonds are going to help form a molecule, and the number of covalent bonds is going to be equivalent to the number of unpaired electrons. So for instance, in hydrogen, we have 1 proton and we have 1 electron existing within that first shell. Now normally, in order for that first shell to be complete, it requires 2 electrons. So hydrogen tends to find other elements to bond with so it can complete that outermost shell or its first shell. So in the figure to the right, you'll notice that 2 atoms of hydrogen are now sharing electrons. Each of them is sharing an electron so that they can both complete those outermost circles or shells. Another molecule that we find forming covalent bonds is going to be oxygen and hydrogen. In this figure on the left, we have 2 hydrogens, each with 1 electron that it would like to share. And we have 1 oxygen molecule, which has 2 electrons that it is looking to share, meaning it's going to try and form 2 bonds typically. In the figure on the right, we see a molecule of water, where the oxygen is actually sharing 1 electron with each of these different hydrogen molecules. or hydrogen elements. We represent this sharing or these bonds in different ways. We have the molecular formula, which is going to demonstrate the total number of atoms that are found for a certain element. We have an electron distribution diagram that we can use to represent these bonds. We also have a structural formula, which consists of kind of identifying each of the different atoms found within a compound or a molecule and representing a single bond with a single line and a double bond, or the sharing of two electrons with a double line. We also find these space-filling models, but oftentimes those will be found a little less commonly. Now, covalent bonds can exist in either a polar or non-polar kind of state. The difference just has to do with the electronegativity of the elements within the actual molecule. So for instance, in the molecule along the top here, we have two carbon atoms that are sharing electrons equally. So they're drawing or kind of attracting the electrons to their nucleus in an equal distribution. That means that the electrons spend the same amount of time around this carbon molecule or atom that they do around this carbon atom. In the figure below, we see a bonding between oxygen and hydrogen. This we term a polar covalent bond because the electrons are shared unequally, which means they tend to spend more time around this oxygen molecule than they do the hydrogen. The reasoning behind that is because of the fact that they're both just sharing one electron, but they have a different number of protons within their nucleus. There are 8 protons within the oxygen atom, and there is only 1 proton within the hydrogen atom. So the oxygen atom has a much greater pull on that electron that's being shared than the hydrogen does. This results in what we call a slight negative or slight positive charge, and a difference in the electronegativity. As we can see with this molecule of water and this molecule of methane, that distribution of electrons is going to be represented in several different ways. Again, the structural formula as well as the molecular formula is something you might see most commonly in the literature and in your text. Now here's a little bit about ionic bonds, which are essentially going to be atoms that are going to gain or lose electrons. So within this animation, we're going to see how ionic compounds are formed. Essentially, an ionic compound is going to be a compound that contains elements that are metals and elements that are nonmetals. In our example here, we have sodium on the left-hand side and chlorine, which is a nonmetal, on the right-hand side. Oftentimes, you'll find them represented in different regions within the periodic table. You also have a group of elements that are going to be kind of non-reactive. So we have this octet rule, which means that elements tend to want to have 8 valence electrons. And with sodium, it has 1 available electron in its outermost or valence shell, and chlorine needs 1 electron to complete its outermost or valence shell. So essentially what's going to happen in this animation is we're going to find that in order to complete each of those shells, sodium will donate an electron to chlorine and make it more negative, and sodium will or chlorine will receive that and become more negatively charged. We call these anions and ions, and they're represented by a positive and a negative charge.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, rate.
Alright, so the other type of bond we have is going to be termed hydrogen bonds. These are essentially going to be weak interactions that form between these hydrogen molecules and a more electronegative atom, such as oxygen. This is really important though, however, because even though it's weak, it still does create a temporary bond that is easily broken. So things like DNA and proteins can exist within this complicated form. Now, with hydrogen bonds, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, our oxygen is going to contain more protons, and it's going to attract or have a greater pull for those electrons. It means that oxygen is more electronegative than these hydrogens, and that's why we have what we call a slightly partial negative charge associated with the oxygen. In turn, the hydrogen is going to have a slightly positive electrical charge to it overall when it's within this particular molecule. It just means that there's more of a positive charge happening here than a balanced charge. So with those hydrogen bonds, because there's a weak positive charge with this hydrogen and a weak little negative charge associated with this oxygen, those in turn are attracted to one another. The pull of positive and negative forces is very strong in nature and responsible for many different behaviors of atoms and various other processes. So it results in these attractions between different molecules, and they actually form a weak little bond, a hydrogen bond. So water tends to be referred to as a polar molecule, and polar molecules are what are going to create these hydrogen bonds. Water turns out to be a very important substance in living organisms, as well as water turns out to be a very important substance that is found in nature. It's responsible for something called cohesion, where molecules of the same kind are able to stick together. It's also responsible for something called adhesion, where one substance can cling to another based on these different characteristics of water. So for instance, in this figure, we have a little water bug that's able to sit atop the water because it is actually able to have a little bit of a bond with that water molecule. With respect to temperature, water is very important for moderating temperature. It helps by absorbing a large amount of heat, which is required to break those hydrogen bonds. It also is responsible for evaporative cooling, where water evaporates and cools the surface liquid that remains. So it cools things down. Additionally, we find that water is found in different states. In the state of ice, those hydrogen bonds are going to be a little bit more solid and separate, and in water, those molecules are going to be more tightly packed together, but they're going to be breaking and reforming constantly. So water tends to be less dense as a solid than a liquid. The other thing to note about water is because of that partial electronegativity, it tends to be a very good solvent. Molecules don't have to be ions in order to dissolve in it. So it makes it very useful for acting as a solvent for other substances. So to recap, we have several different groups of bonds. We have ionic bonds, where an electron is going to be donated or received by certain elements. We have hydrogen bonds, which are those weak bonds that are formed between hydrogen and other substances, such as oxygen. And then we have covalent bonds, which is going to be either an equal or unequal sharing of electrons. A last thing to note is the fact that we have this concept of chemical reactions, which is where the cells are constantly rearranging these molecules. So you find different chemical reactions being driven by these bonds. And we can represent that by the figure we see here. On the left-hand side of this arrow, we have the reactants, which are going to be the elements that start off and undergo the reaction. Then you have this arrow representing the process of the reaction. And on the right-hand side, we are going to have the products that are the result of that chemical reaction. We have something called coefficients, which are going to indicate how many molecules are present. You also have something called subscripts, which are going to basically tell you the total quantity or number of elements that are represented within a molecule. I hope that's been helpful and look forward to seeing you in our next presentation.